So thank you to all the speakers. If I can ask you now to join me in the panel session, then we'll get through some questions. Please continue to post your questions in the Q&A box. There's a few in there at the moment. I will start off with a range of questions, and then we'll go to the ones that you published there. So let me kick off. I think I've got everybody here. No, I didn't see Mark. Mark, are you there? There we go. Hi, Mark. Okay, so let me just start by asking a couple of questions to the panel. So Roger, let's start with you. You talked about a range of interesting opportunities that quantum spookiness, for want of a better word, enables. How close to use by the public do you think some of these technologies are, and what difference will people see in their day-to-day lives?
Okay, thanks very much for the question. Yeah, how close do I think we are for this being used by the public? Yeah, this is always a very difficult question. You know, we're pushing this out. We've done the first demonstrations. Whether the public actually get to use this, in a sense, depends on somehow what wins the battle for new secure technologies. So there's another possible approach, which is quantum secure classical technology. So something that I didn't mention is that the way that many of the existing crypto systems work is in principle breakable if someone can build a quantum computer. And so there's a big push at the moment for what are we going to do in that situation? And one of the answers is we could use quantum cryptography. And a second answer is we could use quantum secure classical communication if such a thing can be developed. And whether this actually eventually becomes used by the public will, in a sense, depend on which one of these wins. So it could be that for super high secure sort of things we want to be very secure on, we use quantum encryption, but then that's probably not used by everyday people, but more used by big organizations, governments, things like that. And it could be that everyone else uses some kind of quantum secure classical cryptography. Or it could be that quantum cryptography wins and then everybody is using it. How big a difference it will make to your everyday lives is, I mean, essentially, you may not even notice it if it's all integrated. So the difference it makes is that people won't be able to hack your communications. But of course, you don't really see that happening. So it's maybe will be quite difficult to notice.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, it's always interesting when these two different or multiple different types of technology are all being developed in parallel, and which one will win the race. And it's always very difficult to work out what the kind of winning conditions are. They're often driven by other factors outside of the science.
Indeed, yeah.
So thank you. So Annette, you talk about making value choices and about the use of AI in different contexts, and the fact that that's been driven by a certain section of society and certain type of people potentially. Who do you think needs to be involved in the decisions about whether we do or do not take AI into a certain space? And how do you create those kind of opportunities for the right kind of discussions to happen?
Great, thanks for your question, Miles. That's a really hot topic in the ethics and politics of AI at the moment. I think one important thing to realize in this domain is that actually we might need to reframe the ways in which we think about expertise in this area. One particularly promising approach in this debate, in my view, has been to value the input from people who are directly experiencing the adverse consequences of AI deployment on a personal level. So the question then becomes, can we supplement the expertise by those who are directly involved in, tech industry developer teams? who might be part of social groups that are not fully representative of the breadth of the population, can we supplement that input with the input of people who actually don't work directly in the tech industry, who may not be computer scientists, but who are interacting very directly in their daily lives with things like algorithmic decision-making systems that have been shown to be biased? So the question is, what's the right institutional model for including these kinds of voices? One good strategy, in my view, is to increase the access of third-party activist and auditing groups that are, comprised not only of tech experts, but also of policy experts, criminal justice reform advocates, other types of political advocacy groups, and to enable those kinds of groups who have a personal lived experience in many cases of what it means to be at the receiving end of things like algorithmic injustice, to equip these groups with the power to audit technological innovations. So finding ways of sharing data that is normally safeguarded by private corporations and letting these groups act as independent third-party auditors in order to determine whether those tools should in fact be deployed at a large scale. So that can often mean sandboxing AI deployment, so constraining its deployment during this testing and auditing phase before making that larger scale judgment call on whether that tool is really ready to deploy it in the world.
Interesting. So I'm going to jump around a little bit. Mark's disappeared off video for the moment, but I was going to go to Philip anyway, because there was a lot of commonality between your and Annette's talk. You're talking about a lot of the same issues from slightly different perspectives. So really it was in some of the kind of pre-stuff that I read, you talked about regulation and policy and how it can't be on the front foot with these technologies. And it's true of a lot of these technologies that move so quickly, having spent quite a bit of time in Python myself. How do you think regulation needs to change to enable the government to do the kind of things that Annette's talking about, and also protect people from the risks and harms that these kind of technologies might create without stifling innovation? Simple question to start with.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a really good question. And I think that the difficulty, like you say, with regulators is that they're always somewhat behind the curve. But we might sort of have to think a bit more about regulating what AIs are allowed to do. So rather than constraining the innovation around the technology and how that advances, but actually more kind of making sure it's not doing things that could create harm in different settings, because there's a sort of qualitative difference between an AI making really good recommendations about what you might want to watch on Netflix or what CDs you might want to buy. I mean, obviously that raises CDs. No one buys CDs anymore. What sort of music you might want to listen to. Obviously there are privacy concerns around that, but it's a much lower risk kind of use of AI than say one of the things that I've become increasingly interested in, which is whether or not people qualify for certain government services. And that's a very different use of AI, but the technology is very similar. And I think that one way we could think about regulation is to say, well, there are certain things AI can do, and there are certain things that it shouldn't be doing. And the other sort of good example is things like military targeting systems that use AI. Is that an appropriate use of AI, or is that something that actually really should be, should humans be a part of that decision-making process still? So I think, that's one approach. But I think, I don't want to go on too long, but I also wanted to agree with Annette to say that I think I sort of suggested this a bit in my own talk, that we really need to think very carefully about who's involved in the conversations around not only what AI is allowed to do, but how it's built and how the platforms are created as well.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting stuff in there, and having kind of thought through this, been a bit involved in the AI world myself, it's not just about AI, it's about algorithms as well. It's the algorithmic approach when you take humans out of those decision-making loops in complex situations, which can lead to unintended consequences, as we saw, for example, with the exam kind of grading system that happened over the pandemic. Okay, that's really interesting. And one of the kind of things that then links that back to what Mark was talking about, he was talking about verification and validation of these systems, because in his context, you're setting these out into faraway places where you can't get access to, and there's a lot of money being involved, and you really don't want any risk to happen or anything to go wrong. I can't imagine what it was like in the US, or NASA and elsewhere this week as they unfolded the James Webb Telescope with the opportunity, the potential for one of those things to go slightly wrong, which completely threw out the whole mission. Must have been an absolute nightmare of nerves. So, Mark, a quick question for you on different types of machine intelligence. There's general intelligence, where machines can do everything and understand and behave like a human, respond to a whole range of different circumstances. And then there's kind of much more narrow intelligence, where they're able to operate in a much more constrained environment. Where do you think the balance needs to sit between those two different types of intelligence for the kind of applications that you're talking about?
Well, let me start by saying that we don't really have what I would consider to be robot intelligence yet. Intelligence, as you mentioned, is at several different levels. But what we consider as intelligence as human beings is far beyond what we'd be capable of with artificial systems. So with regard to the balance, I don't think we need to completely reproduce what humans are and what we're capable of. Many people think that artificial intelligence is about reproducing humans. Well, it's not really. I see robots and artificial intelligence as complementing us, as being something that does things to help us, other things perhaps that we might not be so good at, machines can help us with. So to find this balance, the critical thing is identifying what artificial systems need to do and balancing it in such a way that it helps us in some way. They don't necessarily replace us. Even on other planets, there are many situations where only a human would be able to do certain things, like appreciate the artistic scenery of Mars, for example, is something that a machine would never be able to do. But to be able to find this balance, I think it's a matter of saying, here's the problem, here's the challenge that we have, that we need help with, and then developing systems that will help us with that challenge. And we don't necessarily need to make them much further than that. We don't need to make them, for example, question our orders or what we do or what we need beyond perhaps the needs of the mission to be able to make sure that they survive on other planets. And I am, as I mentioned in my talk, there's a little bit of advantage in exploring other planets in space, and that artificial machines and artificial intelligences don't necessarily have to worry about interfering or interacting with us in the way that we would on Earth. So the balance, I think, in space exploration is the robot really gets very much more power and ability to make their own decisions. Whereas here on Earth, robots should always take into account our needs and our safety and our well-being. So in that sense, the balance is dynamic. It changes depending on the situation.
Okay, no, that's an interesting idea that there might be a kind of divergent pathway between the way these robots develop over time. Okay, so we've lost Roger for some reason. Hopefully he will rejoin us again shortly. Oh, there he is. I can see him come back. Okay, so let me go to some of the audience questions. Roger, are you there? Can you hear me? The first one we had was around quantum, so I think you're probably best qualified to comment on that. If not, I will move on. Okay, so it looks like he's having issue problems at the moment. So Mark, the next one coming back to you. There's a question about how your research in the space community and space exploration fits in with many of the other challenges, that are very pressing challenges that we have here on Earth around climate change and other things. would you contextualize what you do and how that can help solve some of those other problems that we have that many people think are maybe more immediate and should be focused on more than space exploration?
Well, I mean, this is always a question that comes up. I mean, how much should we look in other places versus looking to ourselves? And very much like, I think, your earlier question, there does need to be a balance. If we spend all of our time looking only at the situation on Earth, we tend to miss other details. We tend to miss how vast the universe is and how many possibilities there are out there. Taking Venus as an example, Venus, by current accounts, used to be a very nice place, and that it encountered millions of years ago this runaway greenhouse effect that caused it to become the hellish, high pressure, hot environment that it is now. Despite the fact that if you go, many kilometers up in the atmosphere, there are places in Venus's atmosphere that are actually quite temperate and nice, for our perception as humans. We don't get to see the kind of possibilities that are out there and the kinds of things that have happened in the past and might happen in the future unless we look outside in the universe and we look around. And I think it really helps us understand our place and our history and perhaps our future as a race on this planet with the nature around us. So I do think exploration is important for being able to understand our own problems here at home. I also think that if we don't look outside of our planet and we don't look around and try to expand our horizons as a race, I don't think it benefits us particularly, because the resources that we spend on ourselves, for example, are based on our perceived needs. If we don't perceive that there are problems like climate change, like climate change and other sociological problems, we won't do anything about them. And perhaps looking at other planets and other environments helps us to perceive that these problems are pressing and need to be dealt with, or else our planet might end up like Venus in the future. So I think the resources that we spend on exploration are justified. Certainly we've spent more money on other things closer to home, I think, that have been less useful, perhaps, and less scientifically valuable for us. With respect to robotics and AI, space is like a sandbox. It shows us problems and challenges that we wouldn't encounter here on Earth. And it forces us to develop our technology in ways that we might not otherwise. And there are wonderful spin-off technologies from space technology, from space exploration, materials, systems that work under extreme temperatures can be used in nuclear reactors or when exploring volcanoes. The instrumentation that's used to find life on Mars can also be used to explore very distant and difficult places on Earth where you might not think life exists, like near volcanic vents. And the robots that we develop, I think, because they need to be intelligent, I think that will help us in understanding how intelligence needs to work in our machines on Earth as well. So if we keep exploring these new horizons, I think many of the points raised by the other presenters are important. We should not misuse these technologies. We need to make sure we keep in mind the ethics of what we're developing and the potential impacts. But if we do that, the benefits that we stand to gain are quite great, quite significant.
Thank you, Mark. And I think there's a lot of cross-fertilization and terrestrial applications, a lot of the kind of technologies that need to be developed to explore space that can address some of the challenges we have here. So I think there's a lot of cross-fertilization there as well. Okay, I see Roger's back. Let me choose a quantum one. There's a kind of a question here from Lydia talking about quantum networks, and I'm not quite sure I understand it. Is the size of something related to how we can influence things by looking at them? Perhaps I could move an electron, but not a boulder. Is it to do with size? So I think she's talking about, does the quantum effects only work at certain scales, or are they something that we can see at a much larger scale as well?
Yeah. Okay. So I think I understand what the question is getting at. So firstly, I should say that we should be careful about what exactly is meant by influence. So when we look at something, it's not that we can really choose what its outcome will be, but when we decide to measure something, we can somehow force, say, an electron to randomly choose between its possible options. So in the presentation, I talked about particles having multiple trajectories at the same time. And if we look at the particle in a particular location, if it's a quantum particle, we can make it choose where it appears on the screen. It could possibly have been in any of these positions. When we put a screen there, it has to randomly pick one of those. We can't affect which thing it picks. And now, if we have a larger object, say the boulder that is, I think, mentioned in the question, these are modeled very well by classical theory. And in a way, you can see that, in a sense, they're kind of being measured all the time. So if you think about what a measurement is, or when I see something, what actually has to happen? Well, some light has to hit the object, it has to bounce off and go into my eye. And if I have something like a boulder, there's a lot of light. You can think of it like there's a lot of light hitting this boulder the whole time. And in a sense, it's being measured the whole time. And this is one explanation you can think of as to why large objects like boulders don't appear to be in multiple positions at the same time. They really seem to be quite well fixed. Whereas when we go to these very, very small, very tiny particles like electrons, you can imagine that actually these aren't being measured the whole time. And the laws of quantum mechanics are really obeyed for those. So in short, yes, size really is the important thing. And maybe one of the big difficult questions, or one of the things that we don't really know how to answer, is where exactly that transition lies. So when is something too big and when not? And while in the early days of quantum theory, people were also worrying about this, and people were asking questions like, is the moon there when no one looks at it, for example? So why does quantum mechanics not apply to large objects?
That sounds like it's very much falling into Annette's territory. And I'm very glad that I gave up quantum mechanics early on in my academic career. Okay, I'd just like to change track. So something for both Philip and Annette, I think. So how do we, this is from an anonymous poster, how do we create a different kind of trans-border regulatory oversight that has an ethical framework so that we can get the benefits of AI? Annette, do you want to go first?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that question immediately raises a democratic legitimacy problem, right? Because we don't currently have a world government. So the challenge for us is, at least as people who might be committed to democratic ideals, should we be trying to impose particular ethical and political norms on societies that don't share those same values, or that at least are engaged in entrenched disagreement over those values? A more promising model seems to be to enable national and transnational communities that do share a commitment to some set of plausible ethical and political values to really take a visible leadership role in terms of regulating AI. One really positive example that we're currently seeing in multiple societies is the decision to not deploy technologies like facial recognition tools in law and immigration enforcement. So we've seen multiple American cities making that decision on a local level. And again, that was in response to the concern that actually the deployment of those tools really significantly undermines civil rights and liberties. In particular, there was a concern about the use of those tools further entrenching and exacerbating racial inequality in the US criminal justice system. And we see similar kinds of discourses emerging in the UK and Europe. And so if there's a clear shared concern about the safeguarding of our civil liberties, so ensuring that everyone who is subject to deployed AI technology can actually interact with those tools as a free and equal person, then that's something where policy innovators can actually decide to intervene even at a very local municipal level. And that can often have a spillover effect into other types of constituencies. So we've seen that work as a positive example with facial recognition tools. It might very well be the case that we will see other policy examples in other deployment areas have the same kind of spillover effect. So we can affect change on a more transnational or even wider level even by starting smaller and by innovating in this regulation space without trying to impose a kind of global policy. That being said, I also think it's important to connect AI policymaking to other larger scale policy frameworks that are already out there. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is one really good example. So we've seen with many other kinds of scientific innovation that policymakers have successfully connected this concept of human rights to the regulation of other kinds of technology. Just because AI is very new, we shouldn't adopt a kind of AI exceptionalist attitude and just, immunize AI from any kind of regulation. I think we should learn from other types of scientific regulation that we've already seen in the past, over the past century especially, and see what we can learn from those successful regulation efforts.
Okay. Thank you, Annette. Philip, do you want to add something quickly? I'm conscious we've only got a couple of minutes left.
Very quickly, I mean, I agree with everything that Annette said, but I think the other thing that I think would be very useful actually is to make sure we know where AI is being used and for what task. And I don't think that's currently very obvious. And that would also allow us then to kind of interrogate its use better in a sort of democratic process, because we'd know what services at the local government level it was being used for, or at the national level and so on. And I think that would be and that's a relatively easy thing to regulate. You could just say you have to disclose where it's being used.
Assuming you know where it is and it's not embedded in the system somewhere that you're unaware of.
Well, exactly. And then that's where some work has to be done, because I think that's exactly the cases where it needs to be surfaced. If it's embedded deeply in an information system somewhere, maybe we need to know that before those systems get deployed.
Thank you. Right. Okay. So we have 1 minute left. So I have one kind of much more simple question. I'm sorry I haven't been able to cover off a lot of the questions that you were asked, but this one includes me, so I'll go first. So do you have and use an Alexa-style device at home or at work? So my answer to that is no, neither. I'm Apple, but I turned Siri off very early on. And I'm happy to have a long conversation with people as to why, but the answer is no. Roger, do you?
I have no to either of those, and I don't know, I find them a bit frightening.
Mark?
No, I don't, but it's mainly because they don't complement me as well as they should, and don't do what I need.
So the technology is not quite there yet from Mark's perspective. Annette?
Or the personalization.
Oh, Annette?
I don't have an Alexa either. I'm not planning to get an Alexa in the future, or indeed any other kind of voice assistant. I'm too concerned about privacy issues, but I'm also concerned about enabling a major global corporation to collect massive amounts of data to then train other kinds of technologies that I find more objectionable than Alexa itself.
And finally, Philip.
So I've used all of them on a sort of, I sort of felt I had to. Unfortunately, the one that stuck a little bit is Siri, which I use to help me cook because it's good for setting timers.
Okay, so I'll let people make of that what they will. The fact that none of the four of us really use these things, particularly in anger. So with that, I'd like to thank all our speakers and those of you at home for sending in your questions and spending your time with us today. YorkTalks is running all day, so be sure to join us for the next session, which starts at 1:45. And please don't forget to have a look at the Spotlight competition entries and submit your vote, which closes at 3 o'clock today. So thanks all again, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Goodbye.